Margot saved Kate's life once, and she owes her, even though it means risking her own life by returning to France. I wanted to write about women's roles during World War II that are not often talked about. And I know some of us are going to be talking about research, and that's like the best part of my job. And I got to do a lot of it for this story. And I wanted to get away from the romanticized notions in the Mata Hari to real women in wartime. It's that women had to play roles because the men were off being soldiers or they were prisoners of war. And to me, it's about writing a story about what a woman could or would actually do. Maybe someone like you or me who just had to step up. And it's important to me that it's plausible and relatable. Kate wasn't a born spy. She had to do things by the seat of her pants and think on her feet. On every continent, women stepped up, not only on the home front with work and children, but in other theaters of war. And over the course of my research, I learned so much about women's roles in intelligence, especially in signals intelligence, since women couldn't serve on the battlefield. Many women answered the call of duty, especially in Britain, by learning code, decrypting code, encrypting it for vital communications. And I think also the best stories are things that come from what I hear from people that I meet. I met a woman in France who'd been a young mother during the war. And she had a child and she was living in Lyon. And her father ran a printing press. One day he asked her to carry something under her eggs in her bike basket to transport them out of the city. And she did it because her father couldn't leave the printing press. When she was stopped at a German checkpoint, they saw her. She had her toddler strapped on her back, her eggs in her basket, and they waved her on. At the rendezvous, she was met by the Maquis, who were the underground fighters, and under her eggs were guns. And I asked her, weren't you scared? I mean, how did you feel being in danger with your child? And what I wanted to ask, but I didn't, was how could your father have asked you to do that? And she said, well, my husband was a prisoner of war. We didn't have much, but we had food, a roof over our head, and I really wanted to do something. I wanted to help. So I just went and did it because basically, who's going to look at me, a young mother with a child strapped on her back and eggs in my basket? I think there's so many stories about like that. And I really wanted to highlight this for Kate. You use what you have, and you really can. You can hide in plain sight and you can be bold. It was a different time, another era. And I kept coming across stories like this in my research about ordinary people using their own particular skill or talent to help the war effort. All kinds of people were innovators and chemists, stage designers, makeup artists were used to rethink and invent modes of disguise and sabotage. And speaking of working with what you have, everyone knows probably of the Paris catacombs, the famous ones. Well, they feature in this story. And I got the idea when I was actually visiting the catacombs to do research for one of my Aimé Leduc books, which is my series when I have a modern day computer security detective. So I visited a psychiatric hospital that had apparently during the war hidden Jewish patients by helping them hide or escape through the catacombs. There were actually entrances, and there are entrances to those underground tunnels and quarries underneath the hospital building. And during the occupation, 2 young doctors at the hospital would make maps of these tunnels and use them to help people get in and out. Even today, people still use those maps to get around the catacombs. And I really love that I could use this real event in the story. Keeping things grounded in reality in my writing is important. I talked earlier about showing more realistic versions of women's stories in this book. And that's true, not just of the places and actions, but of the espionage elements too. I've gone to Churchill's war rooms in London, the Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. And that's so interesting because you can see how the pre-James Bond inventions were invented. And there were actual people, there was like a Q in James Bond, who created these weapons and disguised devices that would hide messages like dog poop, it was plastic. They put explosives in dead rats, even a lipstick gun, which I really wanted to try myself. But of course I couldn't, so I let Kate use it. But you can't make this stuff up, really. So I also draw from my own experiences. Part of the story came from when I was stranded in Cairo. I was robbed at the train station. I was broke. I could only count to 5 in Arabic, excuse me. And I couldn't even read the street signs. I couldn't understand what people were saying. Anyway, long story short, everything turned out fine. And I made an Egyptian friend that I still have till today. But what happened was that I had this feeling of being an alien and powerless and kind of, unable to do anything. And how could I survive? So as Kate would feel in the story, in the experiences she would endure, this sort of universal panic. Kate goes to Cairo in this novel, but overall, she feels like an outsider everywhere she goes, but she still makes the most of it, and ultimately uses what she has to get the job done. Excuse me. And I think about, what is this lure of World War II? Why are so many of us still intrigued by it? I mean, just look at me and many of the books today. We still have family and relatives that are still alive. And there are many people who witnessed it, who were active. Sadly, we're losing them. But the war shaped life as we know it in our society today. I think the era is very ripe with tension, and even then the issues that caused World War II were specific to that time period. The themes are universal. What would you do? What would I do, given the high stakes, the danger, and the risks? And to make it plausible, I was always asking myself, what could I have done? What would I have done? And I like to think that I would have stepped up. But there's a big moral ambiguity that writers can plumb. It's not always black and white. Good people do bad things. Bad people do good things. And ordinary people become heroes. So it's interesting for me to bring it out the gray and the nuanced areas. I hope you'll be intrigued and come to 1942 for a night flight to Paris. Thank you.
Thank you, Cara. Sounds fascinating. Next up is Kimberly Brock, the best-selling author of The Lost Book of Eleanor Dare and her award-winning debut, The River Witch. She is the founder of the Tinderbox Writers Workshop and has served as a guest lecturer for many regional and national writing workshops, including at the Pat Conroy Literary Center. And speaking of Pat Conroy, his widow, Cassandra King Conroy, is going to be at our Superbook event in 2 weeks. In Kimberly's book, The Lost Book of Eleanor Dare, what happened to the lost colony of Roanoke remains a mystery, but the women who descended from Eleanor Dare have long known the truth lies in what she left behind, a message carved onto a large stone and the contents of her treasured commonplace book. Tell us more. It sounds juicy, Kimberly.
Hi, thank you so much for having me tonight. I see so many familiar names in the comments, and I'll try and keep an eye on the questions, but I'm kind of terrible at following that and talking at the same time. So I guess I should start with this book to tell you that the jumping off place for this is, of course, the mystery of the lost colony of Roanoke. I think when I was in 4th grade, maybe, is when I learned about the lost colony. And I'm finding that a lot of book clubs that are on the East Coast learned about it in school, but maybe book clubs that are in other places in the States don't learn about that history. And well, we'll just start. Colonization. So the very first British colony that came to the New World with women and children, they landed on Roanoke Island, which is actually on the Outer Banks of North Carolina. They weren't supposed to be there. They were supposed to have been farther north, but they got left there by the ship's captain that brought them over. So it started out badly and it went worse. And they sent their governor back to England for supplies. Now, with him and the colony was his daughter, Eleanor Dare. You may know her daughter's name, Virginia. Her daughter is famous for being the first British child that was born in the New World. That's what they said. And when Dad went back to England, he was not able to come back to find the colony for 3 years. The English were at war with Spain, and all of the ships were being used. So when he came back 3 years later, everybody was gone. There were signs that were left, and it was very mysterious. They looked briefly for the colonists, and they never found them. So I, in 4th grade, was sitting there listening to that story, and I was this really precocious little kid, and I liked that it was a mystery, and it was a story without an ending. So I always loved that. My dad was sort of a hobbyist, I guess. He loved local history, and we had a wall in our home that had our family photograph in the center, and then on one side was family photographs that went all the way back to tintypes on my dad's side of the family, and the other side was the same with my mother's side of the family. And he could point those people out and tell us stories about them and their names. And so I've always been interested in family history. And when I heard the story of the lost colony, that's what I hooked into, was the idea that this family was just lost. So fast forward, I'm young, probably my early 30s, and I have new babies, and I had written my first novel, and I was doing research for that novel. And I came across this obscure piece of history that linked that North Carolina mystery of the lost colony to my home state of Georgia. So, I'm a historical fiction novelist, and all my antenna went up, and I was very excited. And I could not believe that I had grown up about an hour away from the origin of this article and never heard anything about this history in my state. So in 1937, in Edenton, North Carolina, which is about 50 miles inland from where the colony was lost, a stone was found, and it had an inscription on it. A man was in a car on a trip with his wife, and they had stopped on the side of the road, and he tripped over this thing. And it was the end of the Depression, and he looked at it and he thought, maybe it's an artifact, maybe it's worth something, maybe somebody will pay me. So he threw it in his trunk, and they went on their way. And he couldn't read what the inscription said. But when they got down into Atlanta, he went into Emory College with this big 16-pound stone and plopped it down and said, "So what do you think? What do you give me for it?" And over the course of the next few years, the country and a broader audience went nuts, because they thought that it was Elizabethan English, and it was a message from Eleanor Dare, who had survived the colony and a massacre that's recorded on the front of that stone. It says that her husband and child and most of the other colonists were killed. There's about 7 of them left. And basically, it's a tombstone for her family. And then on the other side, it's a message to say, "Hey, Dad, we went that way. Come find me." And I sat on that idea for years, trying to figure out how I could write a story about that. I tried writing it from Eleanor's perspective in that time, and it was really bad. And so I put it away for a long time, and my kids grew up, and we moved back to Georgia, and I went down, I went to Gainesville. The stones are all, there's 40 something of them that were found. It was this huge spectacle in the news. And then the Saturday Evening Post came along in 1942 and debunked the whole thing as a hoax, except for the first stone. Nobody has ever been able to prove or disprove whether it's authentic. So I wanted to see it, and it is at Brenau University in Gainesville, Georgia. I left my kids at daycare and got in the car and went and saw it. And it's in this little archive room, and this tiny little archive room, and this one lady is there, and she lets me in, and I look at this big stone, and I started to cry. And I was so embarrassed, and I was apologizing, and she was looking at me like I needed a little help. And I went and got in my car and drove home, and I couldn't figure out why I was so upset. until I was about halfway home, and I realized that I was angry because I didn't care if the message on the stone was truly attributed to Eleanor Dare, or if she had asked somebody else to carve it, or if it was a big hoax and somebody was just exploiting the story yet again. It was part of her story now, and I was looking at it centuries later, and I was remembering that young mother. And if I had been 19-year-old Eleanor Dare standing at the edge of the world, and everybody I had ever known and loved and everything I had ever known and loved was gone, I think the only thing I would have wanted was to be remembered. So I started thinking about the fact that the stone was lost in 1587, was left there in Edenton, let's say, and then found again in 1937, and then debunked in 1942. And I thought, who would that matter to? It would matter to your family. So if that's your family story and somebody says, that's a bunch of hooey, what does that mean? What do you do with that? If it's not true, does that matter? Or does it just matter that you know it, that it has become true for your family because it's been told? How does that influence you? So I imagined Alice Young and her daughter. She's 13-year-old Penn. She's very precocious, nothing like me. and they go back to this home that they have in Savannah that's been abandoned for years. It's right at the end of World War II. That was just because that's when the stone was debunked in 1942. So I set the book in 45, and they returned to this home and to a book that's been passed down for 16 generations from Eleanor to every daughter after her in the family. And they're the last generation living at that point. So when they come back to Evertell, which is the name of the place, it's fictional. Don't go find it. It's not actually in Savannah. People get very upset about that. They have this book and they sort of have to come to terms with what they believe about it. And it's full of all the things that I think are the ways that women pass our stories and our history down. My research, I did a lot of research, but it wasn't all about the lost colony, because guess what? We just don't know. There's not a lot we know. I made up a lot of stuff, which is fun. That's why I write fiction. But I also searched for women's history and the way that women were moved through colonial America, and they really were being moved. A lot of time they didn't have a choice in how they were being moved. And the way that they left their marks was not in the history books. It was in their arts. It was in the way that they raised their children. It's in their gardens. It's in their journals. It's in their Bibles. It's in their recipes. So those things all went into the idea for what's in the Commonplace book.
And I think they're going to have to find out more by reading the book.
Yeah.
We're sadly out of time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kimberly. Next up is Fran Hawthorne. For 30 years, Fran has built a career as a journalist and an award-winning author, specializing in healthcare, finance, and the nexus of business and social activism. Interesting. But that was all a detour, because in 2018, she published 2 novels, The Heirs, and now her newest, I Meant to Tell You. When Miranda Isaac's fiance is being vetted for his dream job in the U.S. Attorney's Office, the couple joke about whether Miranda's parents' history as anti-war activists in the 60s might jeopardize Russ's security clearance. But as it turns out, the real threat emerges after Russ's future employer discovers that Miranda was arrested for felony kidnapping 7 years earlier, an arrest she never bothered to tell Russ about. Fran, this sounds so juicy.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and thank you for including me with all these other authors in this talk. What I thought I would do is tell you, well, first how I came about to write this book, and then tell you a little about the book. And just one tiny correction. In 2018, I wrote, my first book was published, and then this one was just published this a few months ago. So Okay, I have a lot of cousins, and over the years, we kind of share family stories. And okay, so when I was growing up, my mother had told me that so my grandfather had two sisters, and that one of them never married, lived her life with her mother because she had a mental illness. Okay. And then when I was in my 20s, my mother said, well, actually, that's not true. The reason your great aunt never married and lived with her mother, actually, she was married, but she was divorced. And in pre-war Poland, this was so scandalous in the Jewish community that it was considered preferable, more respectable to say she had a mental illness rather than to be divorced. I thought, okay. And then when my cousins was putting together sort of a family tree, family history, and asked us to contribute what we knew, and I contributed this, and she said, no, that's not what she heard at all, that actually this great aunt had in fact married and had kids. Who knows what the truth is? They unfortunately died in the Holocaust. But it just got me to thinking about how, we get different stories and different branches of the family, how they get changed over the generations. And when I would talk to other friends, it seems like, I don't know, it seems like everybody has a grandfather who had another family, a secret family that no one knew about, or grandpa was a bootlegger in Prohibition or something. There's all these family secrets. So I decided to write a 4-generation family saga that would go through the generations, showing how the stories got warped. And actually that it would be in reverse chronological order, so that you would start with the wrong story and go back and find the truth. The earliest story was going to be a family, in Eastern European, Jewish family. Poor boy falls in love with the daughter of a rich family. This is not allowed. Her family kidnaps him, ships him to America. He promises to save his money and write and send for her, and he does. And it's a very nice fairy tale. That's not true, but it's the one that's told. And then their child, their son, becomes a union organizer in New York City. His girlfriend doesn't really like what he's doing. She's not sure she wants to marry him. But then comes World War II, and he's going off to fight, so they get married. And then their daughter, Judith, her boyfriend, Jerry, in the 60s, become leading activists against Vietnam War, kind of, you name the protests, they're out in front there. The student takeover at Columbia University, the protests at the Democratic Convention in Chicago, out with the grape farm workers striking in California. Their daughter, Miranda, is in more or less the current era, 2003. And as she starts stumbling on family secrets, meanwhile, as Susan said, she has her own secret that she's keeping from her fiance. So, okay, I start writing this book, and I start with the current generations, right? Because it's in reverse order. I start with Miranda and Russ and Judith and Jerry. And at this point, it is totally out of control. I have, 300 pages. I'm halfway through the book, just 2 out of 4 generations. I have characters who want to shove in, and I'm shoving them out because I don't have room for them. I have subplots that I don't have room for. I'm just, pushing through, skimming through my characters. And not only that, I mean, while my research hardly compares with, Kimberly and Cara, who've, gone to Paris and in the catacombs and, researching historical records, as Susan mentioned, I have a career as a journalist. In whatever setting or time frame I'm going to have, it's going to be accurate. I'm going to do my research. If my characters in 2003 are walking across the Arlington Memorial Bridge from Washington, D.C. to Virginia and having an argument, I am going to walk across that bridge, and I'm going to take notes on the height of the guardrails, on what the benches are made of in Virginia. Can you hear the planes taking off from National Airport? If I have a scene in Ellis Island, which I do. Okay, I'm probably the only person on this planet who went to Ellis Island, not to research my family, but to take notes on the style of the chandeliers and the height of the windows. And so I'm thinking, oh my God, these are the easiest stories. These are the current day ones. I have to do research on 2 more generations, 2 different sets of times and fashions and popular books and movies that I was totally freaked out. And my writing coach said to me, Fran, why don't you just lop it off right here with the 2 generations you've done? And I said, oh, that's a thought. So let me try it. So I'm going to kind of summarize for you what I came up with. Miranda Isaacs has always been proud of her family's heritage as social justice activists, yet she also feels that she'll never live up to it. Her grandfather was a union organizer. Her parents were leaders of the 60s protest movements. What kind of cause can she find in boring 2003? She shares those feelings with her fiance, Russ Steinman, who admires her family and also is seeking his own great cause. So when he gets hired as an assistant U.S. attorney in Washington, D.C. to investigate business corruption, it feels like his dream job. Of course, post 9/11, the federal government job, he has to undergo, security vetting. And, Russ and Miranda joke about whether Miranda's parents' history as 60s activists might hurt his security clearance. But actually, the real problem turns out to be something else. The FBI in the vetting discovers that Miranda was arrested for felony kidnapping 7 years earlier, an arrest she had never bothered to tell Russ about. Now, Miranda tries to explain that she was only helping her best friend, Ronit, who was in the midst of a nasty divorce and custody battle. Ronit is homesick for her native Israel. Her husband is very controlling, and she just wants to take her daughter to visit her parents in Israel. She and Miranda don't realize the ramifications of international kidnapping and divorce laws, things like that. Russ is not convinced, and he moves out. Now, their separation ends up dredging up a swarm of other mysteries. For example, Miranda tries to ask Ronit to talk to Russ to explain, but Ronit has disappeared. Russ's mother alludes to something strange in Russ's past. Now, Miranda's father had died when she was a little girl. Her mother has remarried. Her stepfather abruptly reveals that he's been having an affair. He also drops strange hints to Miranda about her biological father. Her mother, Judith, seems surprisingly dead set against Miranda's younger sister going to an anti-war protest against the Iraq War, which Miranda can't understand. This is a much more tame version of the things her parents were doing for years.
And if you want to find out more, we are out of time. You're going to have to invite Fran to your book club so you can discuss it in more detail. So thank you very much, Fran.
Oh, okay, thanks.
And that is a reminder that all of our authors are Novel Network authors, which means they are available for you to schedule book club visits through novelnetwork.com. You can view their calendars and a little bit more about their books. And I also forgot to mention that our theme for today is coming out of the shadows because it is Groundhog's Day. And I'm sorry to say for those of you in cold climates that the groundhog did see his shadow, meaning 6 more weeks of winter. But the good news is that he's only 39% right. So maybe you'll have warm days coming. All right, next up, we have Jennifer Rosner, who is the author of the novels Once We Were Home and The Yellow Bird Sings, the Massachusetts Fiction Honors Book and National Jewish Book. Congratulations, finalist in the categories of debut fiction and book club. She is also the author of the memoir, If a Tree Falls, A Family's Quest to Hear and Be Heard. Beautifully evocative and tender, Jennifer's book, Once We Were Home, is based on the true stories of children stolen during wartime. This heart-wrenching novel raises questions of complicity and responsibility, belonging and identity, good intentions and unforeseen consequences as it confronts what it really means to find home. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you. And I'm so glad to be here. Hello, everyone. um, so the book prize I'm going to give out tonight is my first novel, The Yellow Bird Sings. But since I want you to know about my forthcoming novel, I'm going to try to speak about both of these books and my writing process. And I have 10 minutes. So um, I thought what I would do is talk about some of the inspiration for my writing more generally, which is really personal. So the roots for both of my novels came from conversations. So I was giving a talk for my memoir that Susan mentioned is called If a Tree Falls, which is about raising our two daughters who were born deaf. And I was explaining to the audience how we decided to get our girls hearing technology and how we were encouraging them to talk. And a woman in the audience shared her childhood experience of having to stay silent for 24 months in a shoemaker's attic during World War II. And I just couldn't stop thinking of her, of this child who had to stay silent and a mother who had to silence her child. And especially because we were in the endeavor of, encouraging vocalization and every kind of sound and trying to get our children to make sound. So it was so interesting to me to think of a mother who had to tamp down her child in that way. So this became the kernel of The Yellow Bird Sings. And after thinking about this a long time, I got to interview that woman more fully, and through her I met many other hidden children and interviewed them. And during one of these interviews, I spoke to a woman who told me of some work she did after the war, retrieving Jewish children from Christian settings. So after the Holocaust, and she had been like in a labor camp, taking down trees in a forest. That was her labor. And she comes back to Poland, and only 3% of the children are living, and many of them are in these Christian settings under assumed names. And there was a mission to try to get back these children who were orphans, Jewish orphans. And she told me about her mission. She said, I would go into these villages and we'd buy drinks at the tavern. We'd try to get people to be more loose-lipped, and we'd inquire about, sort of new arrivals, during the wartime. And if it sounded like any of them had been, Jewish children who were then hidden, she would go to those families and try to offer money or try to negotiate to get them back. And then she said that if they refused and if negotiations didn't work, she would just go in and just take them. She would go into the fields at dusk and steal the children. And she was this teeny little woman with these giant green eyes, and she was offering me tuna sandwiches, and she's like, and I went into the fields and I stole the children. I mean, I was I was just flabbergasted. And she kind of used the word kidnapping, but in her mind, you knew that she felt she was saving not just these particular children, bringing them back to Judaism, but saving the Jewish people who had been, nearly annihilated. So that conversation became the kernel of Once We Were Home. I was thinking so much about it. And then I started looking into other stories of children being taken in wartime. And there was a very famous case of these boys in France who were, in a convent for safekeeping. And when Jewish relatives who survived came to claim them, the church actually took them on the run and tried to hide in this effort to save their Christian souls. And then there were other cases too, where people had these sort of ideological views, and these adults, and they were making decisions about where children belonged and who they should be with, etc. Now, before writing each of these novels, I spent time really marinating in these true stories, and then I set them aside to develop my fictional stories. And in The Yellow Bird Sings, there's this very musical girl. She has to be still and silent in the barn with her mother. The mother tells her these nightly stories about a brave girl and her little bird who, avert threats and find safety. And she is, hearing music in her head. And it's like sort of a string that's connecting her and her mother, this story and this music in her mind. Once We Were Home is grounded in these cases of child stealings in wartime, but the novel itself features these 4 very particular fictionalized children, Oscar, Anna, Roger, and Renata. And their stories intertwining as they all wind up in Israel. And I should say that there's a sequel element from The Yellow Bird Sings. So if you are thinking of reading them both, you should read The Yellow Bird Sings and then read Once We Were Home. I thank you for even considering that. So in the course of writing, I did also travel. I traveled to Poland and to Israel, and amid my research, I consulted with all kinds of experts. And I always think it's funny, you know, I worked with mushroom foragers and these masterclass violinists, and I worked in depth with historians and archaeologists. And sometimes I think that writers, if anyone ever searched their Google history, they'd be like, who is that person? Because you're just looking up the craziest things sometimes. I also wanted to say something that both of the novels really share something like an underlying, very personal grounding that is, you know, in our experience of raising our deaf daughters. Like The Yellowbird Sings, it wasn't just this contrast of making sound and having to stay silent. The choice to make the child a violinist came from a story of, I found out that in our ancestry, we had these deaf relatives. I didn't know anything about deafness. I didn't know we had deaf people in our family until our daughters were born deaf. And I learned of these great, great aunts. And one of the most kind of meaningful stories is that I learned that when they would go to bed and they had babies, they tied a string from their wrist to their babies at night, so that in the darkness, if the baby cried, they would feel a tug on their wrist and they would wake up to care for their baby. And this string in the darkness is like, you know, the choice of a violin as a string instrument. I actually brought my dad's violin to show you guys because I have props in I was going to show you a video, but we have no time. So I had my dad's violin, which he played music, you know, all the time. And I sung, and I really knew the power of music. And I also brought these nesting dolls because in Once We Were Home, the question of where and with whom a child belongs, you know, it came to our doorstep as we were raising deaf children, and we made a decision to raise them with access to sound. There were people in the deaf community who felt that they should be raised by deaf people, use sign language, et cetera. And there were like a lot of opinions about where our children belonged. So when I heard this story about, you know, the child is Jewish, so she belongs with the Jews, and the kid should be raised, you know, Christian to save his soul, you know, people have these ideas. But in my mind, it's like, who are the children attached to? Where is the connection and intimacy? What really matters, you know, from the child's perspective? And that's what Once We Were Home is about. So that's what I don't know if I took my 10 minutes, but, you know, I was thinking a lot about, you know, what brings a writer to her desk. And for me, it's these very personal things. And I'm just honored to have the chance to share them with readers. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Jennifer. Both the books sound amazing. All right, next up is Alex Segura, who is the author of Star Wars, Poe Dameron, Free Fall, and Pete Fernandez Miami Mystery Series, as well as a number of comic books. His latest book, Secret Identity, is a rollicking literary mystery set in the world of comic books. Alex uses his expertise as a comics creator, as well as his unabashed love of noir fiction, to create a truly one-of-a-kind novel, hard-edged and bright-eyed, gritty and dangerous, and utterly absorbing. The New York Times called his book wittily original, and it was named an editor's choice. And I know Debbie said she listened to the audio book and was so blown away by what an incredible job they did. We can't wait to hear all about it. Alex, welcome.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Susan. Thanks, everybody, for having us. It's been such a great lineup, and I have to be mindful of time. I'm usually terrible at that. Secret Identity comes out in paperback on Tuesday, so it's actually really great timing to be here. But I want to talk a little bit about the inspiration for the book, what the book is about, and then I'll do a very short reading so you can kind of get a sense of the flavor of the prose. But Secret Identity is set in 1975, mainly in New York City. It's the story of Carmen Valdez, who's a queer Cuban-American woman who moves from her hometown of Miami to New York to pursue her dream, which is to work in the comic book industry. And if you're a fan of comics, you probably know that the comics of 1975 and the industry of comics were very different from the comic book world we live in today, where we have a Moon Knight TV show and Ant-Man movies, and you know, it's really kind of tapped into the zeitgeist and the pop culture in a way that in 1975 it was much more niche. It was a hobby that was only starting to kind of get momentum. You know, there was no comic shop market yet. You know, you bought your comics at a newsstand, and there was really no big continuity between issue and issue to issue. It was much more focused on children. It wasn't the hobby and the obsession that it is today, or the kind of media explosion that's seen today. And the industry itself was driven by fans who had really no no sense that, I'm going to create this character and keep it for myself to make a movie later. It was much more, this is my job. I'm going to write this character and then I'm going to go on to the next script. It was very much, making the donuts kind of approach to the profession. And the reason I did that, I said it in 1975, was because I wanted to have that contrast. I wanted people that were reading the book to see the difference between the comic book world of 1975 and the world of today. And I also wanted to show the story through the eyes of a woman, of a female creator, someone that was looking to get into the industry, and something that was not as common as it is today. I think we see a much greater diversity of creative voices in comics and in publishing in general, but back then it was very male driven and very white male driven. So we meet Carmen. She is working for this third-rate publisher called Triumph Comics. If Marvel and DC are top level, then Triumph is B level or C level, and she's the secretary to the editor-in-chief, this kind of a blowhard named Jeffrey Carlisle, who basically tells her, sorry, I'm hearing some clicking in the background, who basically tells her, there's no opportunities for you to write here, focus on being the best secretary you can be, and maybe down the line I'll have something for you to do, according to my plan. And that obviously is not what Carmen wants to hear. So she's despondent, and she goes back to her tiny New York apartment and is approached by a colleague, this younger editor named Harvey Stern, who has also written some comics for Triumph. And Harvey tells her, look, I know you are a fan. I know you want to write comics. Carlisle just gave me this assignment to launch the first ever female superhero from Triumph Comics, but I want to do it with you. But of course, there's a catch. You can never get exactly what you want in the perfect way. And the catch is she needs to do it anonymously because her boss just told her, I don't want you to write anymore. I want you to focus on something else. And so she creates this character with Harvey called the Legendary Lynx, which is, I guess, if you had to use real world comps, is a little bit of Daredevil, a little bit of Moon Knight, a little bit of Batman. And it becomes a huge hit for the company. And one thing I want to note is that while you're reading the prose, the novel itself, you get pulled into, I always stumble over finding the actual page. You get actually pulled into the comic book as you're reading. So every few chapters or so, you get to be pulled into the comic that Carmen has written and kind of experience the story in two mediums. And so the Lynx becomes a huge hit, and Carmen is kind of basking in the glow, even though it's anonymous. And then Harvey, she finds Harvey murdered. All of this happens in the first chunk of the story, so I'm not really spoiling too much. But that gives Carmen the motivation to not only solve the murder of her friend because she feels bad, obviously, somebody went after Harvey, but to reclaim this character. Because if you know anything about comics, you know that once you're off a book, the book continues. If it's a character like Batman or Spider-Man or the X-Men, they're not all written by Stan Lee. Stan Lee wrote them for a long time and then it got passed on to somebody else. So she knows she's on a clock. Eventually somebody else is going to take over this character that meant so much to her, that dates back to her growing up in Miami and dreaming of being a comic book writer. And she wants to figure out why it's been taken away. So the impetus for the book, dates back almost 20 years to me being in college and reading Cavalier and Clay, the fantastic novel by Michael Chabon about the comic book industry of the golden age in around the World War II era. And one thing that really stuck out to me while reading that book was, I loved it. It was so fascinating to be pulled into that industry and that world, but I really wanted to read the comics that they were talking about. The character they create in that book is called the Escapist, and it's described in so many wonderful, beautiful ways in the book. But the comic book fan in me was like, I really want to read the Escapist comics. And so I thought, wow, wouldn't it be cool if you had a novel that was telling the story in prose, but also had sequences in comics in graphic form. And I just kind of filed it away, not thinking that I would be the one that would eventually execute it. And that's been an amazing kind of dream come true. And then for me, much later, fast forward, I'm finishing up my PI series, the Pete Fernandez novels, which have gotten some acclaim, but I definitely wanted to kind of pivot to do something much more standalone. And my favorite kind of books as a reader are the books that have the elements of noir, the crime, the murder, the tone, the mood, but that also explore new areas or new eras, new industries that are new to me, and maybe not new to everyone else, but it just felt to me like a murder mystery set in comics would be fascinating, not only to people who know comics like me. I've grown up reading comics since I was a small child, but to people that maybe know of comics but don't understand the background of what it takes to make a comic, especially what it takes to make a comic in 1975. And I guess in the hubris of that moment, I thought, well, this is not going to be that research intensive because I know comics. I've read a lot of comics. I've read a lot of history books about comics, but it actually turned into my most journalistic book ever, in that I really wanted Carmen's voice to ring true. And so, I'm a straight man. I didn't work in comics in the 70s. I wasn't alive in 1975. I was like, I really wanted to use the knowledge I had, but also run it through the filter of people that had been there and had that experience. And so I interviewed a lot of people that not only worked in comics, but women that worked in comics. I did a lot of rereading of a lot of these history books, and it became a very research intensive journey. And a lot of beta readers who had that experience, whether it's Carmen's lived in experience or the experience of having worked in comics, were super helpful and informative on that journey. I'm looking at the time and I'm probably not going to get to the reading, but that's okay. So for me, it was really interesting, and it would not be the book that it is today without like the time that so many people graciously gave to me in terms of just talking about what it was like where did comic creators have their apartments in that time in New York City? What was it like walking the streets of Manhattan as opposed to what it is today? Kind of Times Square is kind of this Disney World type area, whereas before it was much seedier and much more dangerous. So I really wanted to blend the 4-color wonder of comics with the dark, gritty, and dangerous New York that doesn't really exist anymore. It's a very different New York City now. And I wanted to evoke a lot of the 70s movies set in New York that I loved, not just Taxi Driver, but films from that era. And Carmen, to me, was such a refreshing character because she isn't your typical PI. She's not a hardened detective. She's very much in the vein of classic amateur sleuth, someone who wants something resolved and gets pulled into something that she's in way over her head. But because she's plucky and resolved and smart and driven, she manages to get to the bottom of the case. And it's a story of what happens when you actually get what you want, what happens when you achieve your dreams, and what is the price you pay for achieving those dreams. And I think the Carmen you meet at the beginning in the prologue, when you kind of get a sense of her as a fan and as a child, to the Carmen you see at the end, I don't want to say she becomes jaded, but it definitely, you see her arc and her journey with comics and the effect it has on her. So yeah, I hope you check it out. It was really a blast to write, and I think it's a fun read in terms of just being able to hop between comics and prose. And I appreciate the opportunity to chat about it for a bit.
Thank you, Alex. And who doesn't love a fun read? Come on, we need that, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Last but not least is Wendy Walker. As I mentioned at the beginning of the program, she was unable to make it after all, but she did send in, it's just a brief 2-minute video, and she is giving away 2 books tonight. As I mentioned, all the winners have to be present to the end of the event to win. In all fairness to our authors, we don't want you to leave. So we're going to take a minute so that we can screen share. So give us just a second, and Wendy's recording will be up in just a second.
Hi, everybody. This is author Wendy Walker. I'm sorry I can't be on the Zoom with you tonight, but I hope you're having a wonderful evening. Thank you for joining. And thanks to A Novel Network and Adventures by the Book for hosting this really fun event. So a little bit about my new release, What Remains, which is out June 13th, 2023. This is the story of cold case detective Elise Sutton. She is faced with the impossible decision of saving one life by having to take another. In the aftermath, she's hailed as a hero, but that's not how she feels inside. She's traumatized by what she's had to do, and she can't remember the exact moment when she had to pull the trigger. But then one day she runs into the man whose life she saved. He had disappeared from the scene and they had not been able to track him down. She realizes pretty soon after that he's not who he says he is. And what follows is a dangerous game of cat and mouse, where Elise will have to pull on all of her resources to save the people she loves the most. This story is a psychological thriller. It's pretty fast paced. It has a lot of forward action, but it also has a lot of factual mystery. It has cold case mysteries. It has a lot of forensic science, and it also takes a deep dive into trauma psychology. So I hope you will pick up a copy of What Remains in June, and I hope you'll read all of the books by tonight's authors. Have a wonderful evening, and I hope to see you soon.
Thank you, Wendy. And she does write the best psychological thrillers. If you haven't picked up any of her books, All Is Not Forgotten, Emma in the Night Before, Don't Look for Me, An American Girl, and of course, her new book coming soon, What Remains, highly recommend. Thank you, Wendy. So final thoughts, I wanted to thank everybody in our audience, all our adventurers who are always incredibly supportive and engaging. I love that you chat with each other in the chat box. Special thanks to Debbie and Amber for running things behind the scenes, and especially to our authors. It's a privilege and a joy to have you guys here tonight. Loved hearing about your books. And hope to see you all, some of you in person soon, some of you on the virtual tour, and someday we'll all get together and have a big party in San Diego. So take you away from the cold climate. So final thoughts go to Heather Wearta. Again, a special thank you to the Amory Area, Wisconsin Library and all the crew there that braved the cold to come out to the library to watch this live on Zoom. You guys are brave and we loved having you. Any final thoughts, Heather?
Oh, just the usual. Every time there's a book bingo, we have a huge list to add to our book club list. And it's so exciting to get to hear authors talk about not only their writing, but their process, the research, what inspires them. It's a really rare chance to get inside the minds of people who can do something that's pretty extraordinary.
Absolutely. And it's always a pleasure. So thank you, and try to stay warm. Come
We'll
to
do
San
our
Diego
best.
sometime, and we'll plan something fun and warm for you. Just a
That
reminder
sounds-
again, we have our Superbook event coming up in San Diego, or virtual if you can't or aren't able to travel, February 16th. We also are planning our first ever, it is not on our website, but if you follow us, stay tuned. We're planning our first series up in wine country, San Francisco, Reading Between the Vines. Really exciting stuff coming. And we are also, if you haven't seen, doing a fundraiser for the Susan G. Komen Foundation in honor of New York Times bestselling author Kristen Harmel, who was sadly diagnosed with breast cancer at the young age of 43, but she did catch it early through her routine mammogram. So she wanted to spread the word about encouraging women to get their mammogram, saving lives by early detection. We have over 60 best-selling authors participating in this amazing event. 20% of all book sales for the entire month of March. From that event, we will donate 20% to the Susan G. Komen Foundation. It's going to be amazing. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us. Stay safe, stay warm, and until next time, what's your next adventure by the book?
Thanks so much.